On day 17 of the Diddy trial, Ryan Gosling took the stand, his haunting testimony revealing disturbing rituals, emotional collapse, and a chilling list that shook the courtroom to its core. The laughter stopped the moment Ryan Gosling entered courtroom 17C of the Southern District of New York. Moments before, the public gallery had been restless with murmurs, reporters tapping away at laptops, legal observers whispering theories, and curious onlookers buzzing over Hollywood's presence in a federal courtroom. But when the doors swung open and Gosling stepped inside, the atmosphere changed. Instantly. Known for his charm, sharp wit, and roles that have made him a cultural icon from Drive to Barbie, Gosling was expected to bring levity or spectacle. But there were no winks, no charisma, and no playful smirk. Dressed in a somber black suit, his face drawn and pale, Gosling walked with a slow, deliberate pace, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. There was no entourage, no fanfare, no guitar slung across his back. Just a man, alone, bearing the unbearable. All eyes locked on him. The gallery froze. Jurors sat up straighter. Prosecutors Damian Williams, Emily Johnson, and Maureen Comey watched him with quiet intensity. Sean "Diddy" Combs, flanked by defense attorneys Mark Agnifilo and Tenny Garagos, blinked rapidly, his usually stoic face betraying a flicker of disbelief. Gosling avoided looking at the defendant. He approached the witness stand slowly, climbed into the chair, adjusted the microphone, and turned toward the bench. Judge Arun Subramanian, firm yet composed, leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Gosling, you may proceed." And just like that, the courtroom braced for impact. Ryan Gosling sat down, his posture stiff and deliberate, and adjusted the microphone with a trembling hand. The room was so quiet that the faint buzz of the ceiling lights seemed to roar in the silence. He took a breath, just one, and leaned in, his mouth close to the mic. "He showed up in my hotel room, every time, at 3 a.m. The words came out like a blade across silk, soft, deliberate, and deadly. The silence shattered. Gasps erupted across the courtroom, echoing from the marble walls to the gallery benches. One woman in the back audibly choked, dropping her paper coffee cup with a splash. A juror covered his mouth with both hands. The gallery shifted like a wave of unease. Reporters began scribbling furiously. A few had already leapt to their feet before Judge Arun Subramanian's voice boomed out. "Order! One more disruption, and I'll have the gallery cleared." The gavel struck once sharply. All eyes turned to Sean "Diddy" Combs. The once unshakable music mogul sat rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly it pulsed. His eyes didn't blink. For the first time in the trial, the calm, confident image he projected began to fracture. On the prosecution bench, Assistant U.S. Attorney Emily Johnson exchanged a glance with Maureen Comey. Sharp, knowing, grim. U.S. Attorney Damian Williams leaned slightly forward, eyes fixed on the witness like a man watching the keystone of a case fall into place. Gosling didn't elaborate yet. He let the silence breathe again, watching it sink in. The weight of his words, though simple, was devastating. In them was a pattern, a timeline, a violation, repeated and specific. Attorney Mark Agnifilo scribbled something onto a yellow legal pad and slid it toward Tenny Garagos. She read it quickly, then looked up toward the witness with a furrowed brow, but said nothing. There was something in Gosling's delivery that made it impossible to dismiss. It wasn't performance, it wasn't entertainment, it was memory and pain. His eyes, usually glimmering with mischief in interviews and on red carpets, now stared hollowly across the courtroom. The jury saw it, the judge saw it, and Diddy, whether he showed it or not, felt it. One sentence had pierced the veneer of celebrity and spectacle, and it had only just begun. A call from someone in Diddy's inner circle inviting him to what was described as a low-key jacuzzi jam session at the music mogul's sprawling Holmby Hills estate. Gosling, then in a period of intense creative exploration, accepted. He expected a night of relaxed networking, maybe some improvisational music under the stars. What he found instead was something he would later describe to the court as a steam-filled chamber of chaos. They said it was just going to be a jacuzzi jam session, Gosling testified, his voice tight with disbelief. What I walked into looked like the set of a horror film disguised as an art installation. The house was eerily quiet. The music, soft, jazzy, strange, seemed to ooze through the air rather than play. The lighting was a deep, saturated red that made it hard to focus, like a permanent sunset caught behind heavy velvet curtains. The bath at the center of the room was not filled with water, but with a bubbling, blood-hued, tomato-based liquid. It smelled faintly metallic, like iron and salt. "I thought maybe it was performance art," Gosling said, until I realized everyone was taking it seriously, too seriously. There were celebrities, some A-listers he knew by name, others obscured by veils, sunglasses, or silence. No phones, no laughter, just protocol. They were told to disrobe, step into the bath, and surrender. Gosling hesitated at first, but the pressure was immense, the environment disorienting. Eventually, he did as instructed. That's when the real ritual began. Surrender, he explained, meant saying your worst memory out loud, no matter how painful. You had to chant it again and again while Diddy circled the tub, humming this melody. It was low, dissonant, ancient, like something you weren't supposed to hear. He paused for a long moment before adding, the water wasn't hot enough to burn, but it wasn't there to soothe either. It felt unnatural. The courtroom sat motionless as Gosling recounted this surreal experience, a night that would become the first of many and the origin point of a psychological descent he never anticipated. What started as an exclusive Hollywood invite had, in his words, opened a door I've never been able to close. If the baths were the beginning of something unholy, what came after, Ryan Gosling testified, was far worse. It wasn't the chanting or the strange liquid or even Diddy's ominous humming that haunted him most. It was the silence that followed him home. It didn't stop when the bath ended, Gosling said quietly, gripping the edge of the witness stand. That was just the opening act. What came next was the surveillance. He described a phenomenon he came to call the shadows, individuals Diddy allegedly assigned to each participant of the so-called creativity baths. Gosling called them silence partners. They never spoke, ever, he said, but they were there, always. He paused to glance toward the jury as if trying to convey just how destabilizing it had been. I'd be at the grocery store and they'd be there. I'd be at the movies, backstage at a show, on a walk with my dog, just standing at a distance, staring, silent. The courtroom was frozen, every person transfixed, no one moved. A juror shifted in their seat, visibly disturbed. I told myself I was imagining it. I joked about it, wrote dumb songs about it to cope. But the fear never left, Gosling said, his voice cracking. You can't laugh your way out of this. I tried. The weight of that statement settled heavily across the courtroom, as even seasoned reporters in the gallery stopped taking notes. At the defense table, Sean Diddy Combs leaned toward his attorney, Tenny Garagos, and whispered something urgent. She didn't respond immediately, but began scribbling rapidly on a legal pad. Mark Agnifilo, seated beside her, remained stone-faced, arms folded tightly. Judge Arun Subramanian glanced over his glasses at the defense, then returned his focus to the witness. Prosecutor Maureen Comey observed Gosling closely, her expression unreadable but focused. Beside her, Emily Johnson jotted a few lines, while Damian Williams nodded faintly, as if confirming a narrative they had long suspected but never fully substantiated. Until now. Gosling looked back down at the microphone. It felt like I wasn't supposed to tell anyone, he said, and the more I stayed silent, the more power it had. What began as surreal was now deeply sinister. These weren't just eccentric celebrity rituals, the prosecution seemed to suggest. This was a campaign of psychological dominance, a carefully crafted machine of fear, and Gosling had lived inside it. Perhaps the most chilling moment of Ryan Gosling's testimony came not in the recounting of rituals or the silent watchers, but in a single, haunting memory from a night in New York. Gosling, visibly trembling now, lowered his gaze as he spoke. It was late. I'd just wrapped a shoot. I was staying at a suite in Manhattan, secure floor, keycard access only. I remember being exhausted, just collapsing into bed. The courtroom leaned in, collectively holding its breath. I woke up around 3 a.m., Gosling continued, his voice thinning, and he was there. Diddy, just sitting at the foot of the bed. A low gasp swept across the gallery. A female juror raised a hand to her mouth. One man seated near the back visibly recoiled. Even seasoned reporters exchanged glances, eyebrows raised, pens paused mid-sentence. He wasn't moving, he just stared, Gosling said, swallowing hard, not like someone waiting to talk, just watching. Judge Arun Subramanian, who had been following the testimony with a steady gaze, leaned slightly back in his chair. For a moment, he seemed to consider pausing the proceedings. But he didn't. He nodded, permitting Gosling to continue. I didn't know if I was dreaming, Gosling added, but then he leaned forward and he whispered, really slow, "The bath is never drained, Ryan Gosling. It remembers you." A wave of reaction hit the courtroom. One juror visibly flinched. The room buzzed with tension as attorneys scrambled to process what they were hearing. On the prosecution side, Damian Williams pressed his lips together, nodding slowly as if this final piece of testimony completed a puzzle. Maureen Comey leaned into her notepad, scribbling intensely. Emily Johnson looked up at the judge, her brow furrowed with concern. Meanwhile, at the defense table, Diddy remained eerily still. For the first time during the testimony, his lips parted ever so slightly. Tenny Geragos leaned in to whisper something, but he didn't respond. Mark Agnefilo's hands gripped the table, his jaw tense. Gosling sat upright in the witness chair, but his voice remained hollow. "I didn't scream. I didn't move. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just waited until morning and checked out." What had begun as a story of strange celebrity excess had spiraled into something darker, an unspoken fear, now spoken aloud. And the jury would not forget it. Ryan Gosling's voice grew quieter as his testimony shifted from the surreal to the deeply personal. What had once sounded like a bizarre fever dream now revealed its long and lingering impact, years of psychological fallout that followed him like a ghost. "I tried to laugh it off. I joked about the weirdness in private," he admitted. "I even wrote songs, ridiculous ones. I'd strum a few chords, tell friends it was just a weird Hollywood story, but it wasn't a joke to me. Not really." The courtroom sat in uneasy silence as Gosling reached for a tissue. The star, often portrayed as effortlessly cool and unshakably composed, now appeared vulnerable, his hands trembling, his voice breaking intermittently. "Every time I closed my eyes," he said slowly, "I was back in the soup. That bath was never about cleansing, it was about control." The phrase lingered in the air like smoke. Damian Williams, the U.S. attorney leading the prosecution, nodded solemnly. It was a pivotal moment, the kind of testimony that moved beyond spectacle and toward something undeniable. Gosling explained how the experience affected not only his mind, but also his work. "There were scripts I couldn't read, songs I couldn't finish. I'd lock myself in a studio and just stare at the wall. I couldn't connect to anything creative. It killed something inside me." He spoke of insomnia, depression, and sleep paralysis, of waking up in a cold sweat, heart racing, convinced someone was watching him, even when alone, of retreating from friendships and collaborators, of the growing sense that he had become a prisoner of his own silence. "For a while," Gosling said, "I thought I was losing my mind. But I wasn't. I was just carrying a truth no one wanted to hear." At the defense table, Mark Agnifilo scribbled furiously in his legal pad, his jaw locked and unreadable. Tenny Geragos leaned in to consult with him, eyes flicking between Gosling and the jury. Meanwhile, Judge Arun Subramanian looked on with a steady expression, measured but not unmoved. This wasn't just a tale of celebrity excess or strange parties behind closed doors. It was, as Gosling made painfully clear, about the erosion of self. The courtroom, jury, gallery, and even the press seemed to collectively absorb that weight. And in that moment, the cost of silence became tragically clear. If the courtroom had been simmering with tension throughout Ryan Gosling's testimony, the final minutes brought it to a full boil. His hands were clasped tightly, knuckles white, as he leaned forward one last time. "During one of the baths," he began, voice barely above a whisper, "I saw a laminated list floating in the tub." The room held its collective breath. Even jurors who had maintained a professional composure throughout now leaned forward, eyebrows raised. "Names," Gosling continued, "all A-list. People you know, people you admire. Some I didn't expect. Some I wasn't surprised by." He paused, swallowing hard, eyes locked on the wood grain of the witness stand. And then he said it. At the top, mine, with a check mark. A wave of gasps swept the gallery like a sudden gust. Phones dropped, pens fell. Someone audibly whispered, "Oh my God." The tension snapped, and with it came chaos. Judge Arun Subramanian slammed his gavel down sharply. "Order! If there's another outburst, I will clear the gallery." Silence fell, heavy and immediate. On the prosecution bench, U.S. Attorney Damian Williams exchanged a glance with Emily Johnson and Maureen Comey. Johnson whispered something inaudible, eyes narrowed. Williams simply nodded, measured but clearly registering the gravity of what had just been revealed. At the defense table, Mark Agnifilo pushed his chair back ever so slightly, his face pale and unreadable. Tenny Geragos gripped her pen so tightly it looked as though it might snap. Diddy, still motionless, stared blankly at Gosling, his face an emotionless mask. Gosling, for his part, remained steady now, resigned perhaps, but unshaken. They had plans, he said, the words coming slower, quieter, and I was just another name in the broth. The metaphor landed like a dagger. The audience seemed to stop breathing. This wasn't just about bizarre rituals anymore. It was, in Gosling's words, a system, a structure, a list. Whatever the defense had prepared for, it wasn't this. As Judge Subramanian announced a recess, the court officer had to instruct the press and public to exit calmly. No one spoke. No one knew what to say. One thing was certain. Gosling's name, and that list, would haunt the courtroom long after he stepped down. When Ryan Gosling stepped down from the witness stand, the air inside courtroom 6D felt like it had been vacuum sealed. The kind of stillness that follows catastrophe, not relief, but awe-stricken silence. Every seat was filled, yet no one moved. Gosling did not make eye contact with anyone as he returned to his seat in the gallery. His face was pale, lips pressed tightly together. A security officer instinctively shadowed him as he passed, as if to shield him from unseen currents. The jury, 12 ordinary citizens now dragged deep into an extraordinary world, watched him with a mix of empathy and disbelief. One juror, a middle-aged man in a navy blazer, gave a small, solemn nod. Another, a young woman with tortoiseshell glasses, covered her mouth with a tissue and blinked rapidly, fighting tears. At the prosecution table, Assistant U.S. Attorney Emily Johnson appeared momentarily overcome. She tilted her head down, dabbing the corner of one eye with a discreet tissue. To her right, Maureen Comey remained statuesque, but her fingers, clasped together on the table, were bloodless with pressure. Damian Williams kept his eyes trained on Gosling, jaw set, his body language saying everything his face would not. This testimony mattered. Across the aisle, the contrast couldn't have been starker. Sean Diddy Combs sat frozen in his seat, shoulders tight, fists curled against his thighs. His expression had hardened to stone, jaw locked, eyes unfocused, staring at the back of the courtroom wall. Not once did he look at Gosling. Not during the testimony. Not after. Tenny Geragos leaned in toward her client, whispering urgently, but Diddy didn't respond. Mark Agnifilo, meanwhile, sifted furiously through his notes, his face etched with frustration. The defense team looked caught between disbelief and damage control, aware that the optics of the day had just shifted irreparably. Judge Arun Subramanian called for a brief recess, but his gavel this time came down softer, as if even he understood the delicacy of the moment. The courtroom did not erupt. It didn't need to. The silence spoke louder than outrage. And as the court officer instructed those in attendance to rise, all anyone could think was, Gosling had changed the trajectory of this trial. Not with spectacle, but with truth. Raw, searing, and impossible to forget. Outside the imposing doors of courtroom 6D, the atmosphere was electric. Reporters, camera crews, and flashing lights crowded the narrow hallways of the Southern District of New York courthouse, all eager to capture the first reactions to Ryan Gosling's deeply unsettling testimony. Standing just steps from the courtroom, defense attorneys Mark Agnifilo and Tenny Geragos faced the swarm with practiced composure, though their terse responses betrayed the pressure mounting behind closed doors. Mark Agnifilo spoke first, his tone clipped and measured. This testimony, while dramatic, is uncorroborated and sensationalized, he said firmly, shaking his head slightly. We will respond accordingly as this case unfolds. Tenny Geragos echoed the sentiment, emphasizing that Gosling's account lacked evidence beyond his personal assertions. We urge the public and the jury to consider the full context and not be swayed by emotional theatrics, she added. Yet behind the carefully crafted public statements, sources close to the trial whispered a different story. Legal insiders admitted in quiet conversations that Gosling's testimony had unmistakably altered the courtroom dynamic, and not in the defense's favor. One observer familiar with both sides remarked, "If this trial is a war of perception, Day 17 belonged to Gosling. The witness's raw vulnerability, the surreal nature of his experiences, and the shocking revelation of the list had shifted public sentiment and jury focus alike. The defense had hoped to portray Gosling's story as outlandish and self-serving, but instead it had humanized him in a way few expected." Within legal circles, speculation grew that the defense might now have to pivot, recalibrating strategies to manage the emotional fallout and counter the growing narrative of control and fear Gosling described. Experts predicted that Mark Agnifilo and Tenny Garagos would push hard to undermine Gosling's credibility, possibly questioning his mental health or motivations, moves that could inflame tensions even further. For the prosecution, led by U.S. Attorney Damian Williams, the challenge would be to maintain this momentum while carefully navigating the line between compelling testimony and sensationalism. Outside, as the press dispersed, one thing was clear. Gosling's testimony had not only shattered the silence of the courtroom, but had fundamentally reshaped the battle lines in a trial already gripping the nation. The defense, once confident, now faced an uphill climb against a narrative too vivid and haunting to ignore. As the courtroom emptied and the day's proceedings came to a close, a heavy silence lingered, one that followed Ryan Gosling out of courtroom 6D and into the waiting press and public. Gone was the image of the charismatic star from La La Land or The Notebook. In his place stood a whistleblower, a man unveiling the shadowy depths of Hollywood's most guarded secrets, an industry drenched in power, fear, and ritual. For weeks, Sean Diddy Combs had maintained a public persona of success and charisma, bolstered by a legion of fans and the trappings of fame. Yet Day 17's testimony shattered much of that facade. The carefully constructed image of the mogul now appeared fractured and fragile, replaced by something far more sinister and complicated. The unsettling portrait painted by Gosling left no room for innocence or denial. Judge Arun Subramanian's words resonated throughout the courtroom, striking a somber tone as the proceedings moved beyond tabloid fodder into the realm of grave legal scrutiny. "We are no longer in the realm of celebrity spectacle," he reminded all in attendance. "We are dealing with serious allegations under oath before the United States of America." The judge's warning underscored the trial's profound gravity. This was no longer a story about fame or fortune, but about power wielded in ways that cut deeply and darkly beneath the surface. The creativity baths, the silence partners, the chilling rituals. It was a narrative that unsettled even the most jaded observers. In this courtroom, the bath remembers. And on Day 17, Ryan Gosling ensured that the world would remember too. As the courthouse doors closed behind him, the image of Hollywood's glittering veneer cracked wide open, revealing a world where control, fear, and survival interlace in the shadows, an uncomfortable truth now impossible to ignore.